Fiscal policy is very much criticized by economists because the many problems associated with it, especially discretionary fiscal policy. Criticism is all the politics involved because discretionary fiscal policy is being decided, the discretion being used is being used by Congress, which is a bunch of people who don't necessarily have any economics background. There's no requirement that you be trained in economics to be elected to Congress. And yet, once you're elected into Congress, you'll be wielding the power of taxing and government spending and therefore creating major impact in the economy. So that politicians are not necessarily economists is a big problem. Another problem is that politicians tend to do things, not necessarily for the good of the economy, but they like to do things to keep their jobs as politicians and to be reelected and promoted within the political system. They do things that are popular. The things that make them popular tend to be expansionary policies, promising to, put in all kinds of government spending programs, and things like cutting taxes is always popular also. These tend to be the expansionary policies, and then the contractionary policies of cutting government programs and increasing taxes are not popular, so they don't like to put those through, thus leading to situations where Congress continually votes for expansionary policies that get us into debt and are loath to get us into contractionary policies that will balance that debt out with surpluses. Here's the thing, in expansionary policy, to be expansionary, you're trying to increase aggregate demand. So you increase the components of aggregate demand, such as increasing government spending, which is a component, or increasing consumption by cutting people's household taxes. In times of expansionary policy, you would decrease taxes, making tax revenues smaller, and increase government spending, which is make the government spending component big, and you would most likely run into a deficit. For contractionary policy, it's going to be the opposite. You're wanting to decrease aggregate demand, and so you would increase taxes. So you're taking more money away from households in taxes, so they won't spend as much. And you're increasing tax revenues, therefore, and decreasing government spending, so you're likely to run a surplus. Problems come in that in a recession, if this is the original graph for the economy, that they are in a recession. So they're in a recession, they would use expansionary policy to increase aggregate demand by increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. The goal is to get aggregate demand to operate at AD2. The problem, however, is going to come in that when they do the expansionary policy, in which they are increasing government spending, decreasing taxes, they're likely to run into the problem of a budgetary deficit. How do you fund that deficit? How does the government spend more than it takes in taxes? They have two options. If you're a sane country, you sell bonds. If you're an insane country, you print money. So most likely, your country's going to sell bonds to fund the deficit. Here's Ben Bernanke. He's the chair of the Fed, which is the institution in charge of selling government bonds in the United States. He says, hey, you want to buy a bond? When he says, hey, you want to buy a bond, to anyone in the world saying, hey, anyone in the world, do you want to lend me some money? Do you want to lend the U.S. government money? Because we want to spend more than we took in taxes. When you sell bonds, you're wanting a loan. So on the loanable funds market, the government now saying, hey, we want to borrow money, is saying we want loaned funds. And so the demand for loanable funds increases. Just that act of the government now saying, oh, at every possible interest rate, we also want loaned funds. Then the total quantity of loaned funds that's demanded is going to increase at each possible interest rate. The government doesn't care what the interest rate is. All right, so then equilibrium in this market is always where the two intersect, the supply and demand intersect. And so the equilibrium interest rate in the economy is going to be higher. So here we're going to put them side by side. Remember, investment demand, that title, investment demand, means there's only a demand curve. There's no supply curve in the investment demand graph, so don't put in a supply curve. That investment demand curve, it sits all by its lonesome. It's so lonely. So it's always going to hang out with the loanable funds graph. Okay? The investment demand graph has no supply curve, so it has no equilibrium. Equilibrium always tells us what the interest rate is for loanable funds, but in investment demand there's no supply, so there's no equilibrium point. So it has to depend and hang out with the loanable funds market to say, hey, will you tell me what the interest rate is? So the loanable funds market at first is going to say interest rate is rate sub 1. And the investment demand graph can then respond and say, oh, okay, I know that at rate sub 1, the amount that the businesses will spend on capital is going to be a certain amount, let's say $50. But then the government gets involved in the loanable funds market by saying, hey, want to buy a bond? Demand increases in the loanable funds market, causing the equilibrium interest rate to increase. So loanable funds is going to say, hey, investment demand, guess what? Interest rates went up. Oh, and interest rates went up? Okay, then at that higher interest rate, rate sub 2, the amount that businesses would want to buy in capital is going to be only $40 worth of investment spending. The government involvement in selling bonds causing lower levels of investment spending is called the crowding out effect, and it is stressed over and over and over by critics of fiscal policy. The huge sin of the government is to hamper the business efforts of its own domestic businesses, because you will hamper then future growth. If businesses aren't buying as much capital, then in the future you're not going to have as much stuff. So your production possibilities curve is not going to have as good a chance at economic growth in the future. Notice that at the bottom of this, the decrease in aggregate demand is going to be the final impact in the crowding out effect, because investment spending is a component of aggregate demand. The whole thing started off, if we back up in time, go back all the way back, and then we find out why did this whole thing start in the beginning. It was because we were in a recession and we wanted aggregate demand to increase. But the side effect is going to be that, okay, you're going to get it to increase because of the increase in government spending and the decrease in taxes, but it's going to be offset. The increase will be offset by the decrease in investment spending because the government raised interest rates by selling bonds. Additionally, the higher interest rates will cause a decrease in net exports, because at the higher interest rates, the bonds of your country also have interest rates attached to them. So if interest rates increase, the interest rate on the bonds is also going to increase, making your bonds more desirable. So foreigners looking to buy bonds around the world look at your country and say, whoa, their interest rates just became more delicious. So we want to get those bonds. If we're talking about Japan, then it's countries saying, oh, we want to get those Japanese bonds. They're so delicious. They're higher in interest rate. But to buy the bonds, you need to get what first? The currency of the country. So if we're talking about Japanese bonds, the foreigners are going to first have to get yen to buy the Japanese bonds. So they're going to go to the currency window. Hey, knock, 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 knock. Can I get yen? Can I get yen? And all these different investors are going to start saying, hey, can I get yen? Can I get yen? If you work at the currency exchange, if you're the one selling the yen to foreigners, and you see all these foreigners want yen, then what are you going to do to the price of the yen? Raise it. So the price of the yen increases, which translates to a strengthened yen. Citizens who are already in Japan, who have yen in their pocket, are going to say, whoa, the yen in my pocket, can you feel that? It just got stronger. Right? It's able to buy more foreign stuff. Yeah, yen's stronger. So you go and you buy lots of foreign goods, which means lots of imports coming into Japan. So you might have, if you watch the news, been noticing that the yen is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And with that, the imports into Japan are increasing, which means for the net export figure, when you have exports minus imports, if your imports get bigger, your net export figure is going to get smaller. So it's going to lead to an overall decrease in net exports, another component of aggregate demand. So the side effect of running a deficit and selling bonds is going to be higher interest rates leading to less investment spending and less net exports. So you have these two offsets. And whether or not they totally cancel the increase is up to debate. That's up to you guys to become scientists and discover real formulas that we can trust as to the true offsetting impact and the true expansionary impact. So the last part talked about the problems when they run expansionary policy in a time of recession. Now we're going to talk about problems when they run contractionary policy in a time of demand pull inflation. Remember that the problem when there's demand pull inflation is not that there's too much GDP being made. So you see the X is going to the right side of long-run aggregate supply. The problem with operating there is not that the GDP is too high. That's not a problem. But the problem is that the prices are too high. We don't like the prices to be greater than the price level associated with just making potential GDP. So we say, oh, we reached potential GDP, that's perfect, stop. And if you try to push it further, we say now the prices are too high, and we don't like that. For contractionary policy, the aim is to decrease spending, total spending in the economy, to bring aggregate demand back to the aggregate demand 2 level, to shift it to the left. In order to do so, you would decrease government spending or decrease consumption by increasing household income taxes. When you do this, you're going to have then an increase in tax revenue because you've increased taxes, and you've possibly decided to combine that with a decrease in government spending. Either one is likely to lead you into a surplus. And
individuals, if you run a budgetary surplus in your household, that's great, right? That's sweet. It means that you took in your income and you spent during the month, and you find that, whoa, I didn't spend all that I took in my income. Fantastic. That's actually good and responsible. But as a government, taking in more than you spend is not necessarily good. It will have problems associated with it. If you decide to pay off your debt, because that's what a responsible household would do. If you come to a month, as a person, if you came to a month in which you made more than what you spent, then that extra money, if you have racked up a bunch of credit card debt, the responsible thing to do with that extra money is pay off your credit card debt. As a country, though, that's a problem because you're going to be paying off bondholders and giving them money to say, oh, here's the money I owe you, here's the money I owe you, which means that you're putting money out into the economy.
And if you put money out into the economy in a time of demand pull inflation, the people are just going to turn around and spend it. And it's going to cause total spending to increase again. And it will offset the contractionary intent of the policy. So that's a problem to pay back your debt when you run a surplus if you're trying to fight demand pull inflation.
So that's a problem to pay back your debt when you run a surplus if you're trying to fight demand pull inflation. The other option is to impound the surplus. By impound it, it means that you take the surplus, right, and you put it in a little jail, right? So here's my little jail for the surplus. We're going to just lock it up. Don't use it. Don't let it out into the economy because there's too much money out in the economy in the first place. That's why we ran the contractionary policy, was to suck out money from the economy.
So we don't want this surplus money going back out. We'll lock it up. Which on the graphs is going to be something where aggregate demand started off at AD1, which was a demand pull inflation. They run the contractionary policy, so it lands at 82. They run a surplus, and they lock it up. They impound it, so it just sits at 82. No offset. No offsetting impact. Okay? So graph-wise, everything comes out hunky-dory when you impound it. That's on the graph.
Politically, however, if you lock up people's money, the tax money you've collected,
and the tax money that you collected because you raised taxes, you told people, oh, we need to raise taxes on you. You got to pay more to the government. And then you tell them, we collected too much, but we're just going to hold on to it. That will not go over well at all.